Did you watch the circus last night? One of my listeners called in today and said, we shouldn't call this a committee or investigatory committee. We could call it better an inquisition. Last night, we saw lots of alleged shock new footage, most of which we'd seen before, some very short snippets of interviews from subpoenaed individuals. But one thing that strangely was missing from the January 6th Inquisition was this cut from my former boss, President Trump.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, which of course is our right as Americans in the greatest nation on God's earth, and it is enshrined in our Bill of Rights as the First Amendment. That's not what insurrectionists call for. On the other hand, we have seen real insurrection in America. We have seen the instigation of violence for years. Just wind the clock back to the BLM riots, the Antifa riots. Do you remember how they lasted for months and months and months? The independent region of Chopped, what happened in Seattle, what happened even in Washington, D.C., and then the damage that was done to America. According to insurance companies, between 2 and 3 billion, with a B, 2 or $3 billion worth of damage done to this nation. It's not just physical damage. It's not just to businesses. It's also the lives lost. Who can forget Captain David Dorn, a retired police captain who got a call from his friend that they are about to loot my shop. Will you help me, Captain Dorn? And as if he was still in uniform, he said, of course. He left his wife at home and he went to his friend's store to help protect it from the looters, from BLM and Antifa. And what happened next? Live on Facebook, he was filmed bleeding out. He died on social media, killed by the rioters, nary of whom paid any price. Or, of course, there is another individual. There is David Underwood, an officer for the Department of Homeland Security, who was killed in California, likewise, by the baying mob, by BLM, by Antifa. So let's talk about real insurrectionists. I don't know if you're familiar with my past life before I joined the Trump administration, before I came to Newsmax and to Salem Radio. I served in the British Army, in the Territorial Reserves, in a military intelligence unit, and I was proud to do that. But then I moved to America. I became a DoD civilian in the Pentagon, and I worked with our military, our Marines at Quantico. I spent 2.5 years teaching irregular warfare and counterterrorism. I love our devil dogs. I'm still associated with Fort Bragg, where I've worked with the 82nd Airborne, the Green Berets, the JFK Special Warfare School, with one specific mission: to help our warfighters to understand real insurrections, to understand irregular warfare. That was my job. And one small detail, one specific detail of real irregular warfare, real insurrection, is that it must be armed. In the history of irregular warfare, from when those brave Greek warriors got into that wooden horse outside of Troy, right up to the irregular warfare done by our Green Berets, our Delta Force operators and others, is that you better have some weapons. None of the people arrested after January 6th had a firearm. In fact, the only person who was killed with a firearm on that day was a 14-year Air Force veteran named Ashley Babbitt. Yes, Nancy Pelosi. Yes, Chuck Schumer. Say her name. This woman wasn't carrying a gun. She wasn't an insurrectionist by any meaningful sense of the word. And she was murdered by an officer called Michael Byrd, whose identity was kept secret for more than 6 months, a man who has a track record of misuse of his firearm, and who was given a medal, who was lauded by the Democrats and by Nancy for killing that unarmed woman, that unarmed Air Force veteran. But why should we be surprised? Who are the real extremists in America? They would have you believe that it's MAGA hat-wearing conservatives, the new domestic threat of Christian fascists. That's strange, because there's nary any evidence of that. What we do have is lots of evidence of incitement to violence from them, from the Democrat establishment. Let's just listen.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price.
I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
When was the last time an actor assassinated a president?
If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome.
When they go low, we kick.
Those are Democrat politicians. That's a former attorney general. That's Chuck Schumer threatening violence to Supreme Court justices. It's also the Department of Justice now. Who can forget Attorney General Merrick Garland unleashing the dogs of war, unleashing the FBI against American parents. For what crime? Because they wanted their children to go back to school, not to be masked, not to be taught bigotry in the form of critical race theory or pedophilic pornographic material. That's the threat to America, parents. Let's look at the latest instance. I worked in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for Strategy. One of my colleagues, one of the hardest working guys in the White House, was Peter Navarro. He was the Trade and Economics Advisor to President Trump and one of the architects of our policy towards China, our trade war with China. Peter Navarro was arrested last weekend at the airport in Washington, D.C. What was his crime? Was he a member of a cartel? Was he a murderer? Was he accused of political assassination? No. Peter Navarro refused to comply with the subpoena to the January 6th Inquisition, and rightly so, because it is illegal. There can never be an investigatory committee of Congress that does not have nominees from both parties. The conservative nominees from Kevin McCarthy were rejected by Queen Nancy Pelosi. As such, it is not a real committee. She chose two never-Trumpers, the despicable Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. Therefore, it is an illegal committee. Peter Navarro was arrested, put in handcuffs, and put in leg irons at the airport. Then he was taken to the cell where they put John Hinckley, the attempted presidential assassin. And that's not about Peter. It's about all the 74 Americans that voted for Donald Trump. This is a message to all of you. Then what happens a few days ago? Somebody traveled, a Democrat voter traveled all the way from California to the home of the Supreme Court Justice who was threatened by Chuck Schumer. Nicholas Roske had a knife, a crowbar, a gun, ammunition, and zip ties. And he has already admitted in court that his mission was to assassinate Brett Kavanaugh, the man that Chuck Schumer threatened. So, what do we do now? We are at a culminating point, my friends. They don't want to do politics anymore. Look at this shocking statistic from the radical Southern Poverty Law Center that was an inspiration to James Hodgkinson, the attempted assassin that tried to kill Steve Scalise and many more Republicans at that baseball field not too long ago. This is a survey of young Democrats, young male Democrats, and it says that 44% of them would approve of the assassination of a politician who they deem to be threatening democracy, whatever that means. That's the threat to America. Not parents, not former White House officials, but Democrats who think political violence is okay. So what's the message for this show tonight and the people you will meet? Courage, my friends. After 2 years of COVID, we have to find our courage again. We have to stand up to the bullies. And here's the good news. Just as with Ceausescu in Romania, just as with the Moscow Putsch, the harder the dictatorial tendencies try to clamp down on free men and women, the more fragile their grasp upon us will become. Educate yourself. Look at the plan. It is called The Long March Through the Institutions. I have laid it out for you in my latest book, The War for America's Soul. Educate yourself on what they're trying to do to America. Read it, and then read the exclusive interview at the end with President Trump on what it's going to take to defeat them and how we get him back into the White House and we have America first once more.